What if the ancient stones standing silent in our modern exhibit halls are far more than passive relics of a dead world? What if they are the lingering remnants of an intentional, highly guarded design, a structural system established to preserve a specific lineage across thousands of years? An inheritance designated not by the random turning of human history, but by the deliberate intent of entities operating far beyond the horizon of common understanding. These are the lineages that have quietly slipped from contemporary awareness, yet were never abandoned to chance. Traditions and bloodlines that were closely monitored, recorded, maintained over generations with the kind of methodical rigor that becomes unmistakable when you examine the physical evidence left embedded in the soil of the ancient Near East. This is not a notion drawn from modern folklore or speculative fiction. At its core, it rests upon enduring physical artifacts, unearthed from the deepest archaeological strata on Earth. Words carved into rectangular tablets of river clay, baked solid under the intense heat of the Mesopotamian sun. Organized in formal temple vaults and preserved by the very culture that first gave humanity the written word. It is a profound clue to discover claims of this nature, and it demands that we pause to consider what these inscriptions are actually telling us. Because what is pressed into these cuneiform lines is no mere artistic metaphor or symbolic poetry. It is a consistent and repeated record that appears throughout the entire administrative legacy of early Sumer, an account far too central to their societal framework to be brushed aside, yet far too challenging for conventional historical models to comfortably embrace. It resides precisely on the outermost margin of standard academic narratives, neither simple myth nor something easily fitted into modern historical categories. And that exact tension is what makes it so important to explore. And among these vast archival collections, epigraphers uncovered a distinct class of tablets bearing a restrictive scribal stamp, Nissi Tuppi, the hidden knowledge of the tablet, explicitly marked as forbidden to anyone outside the consecrated order. These were not public legal codes or simple trade ledgers. They were restricted, kept apart, intended solely for the eyes of the highest temple ranks, figures whose spiritual duties were deeply bound to the political stability of early city-states, which forces a fundamental question. What specific records were deemed so critical and so potent that they had to be systematically withheld from the rest of the world? The Sumerians called this fundamental governing mandate Nam Lugal, the sacred authority of true kingship. And from the earliest days of their record-keeping, they were entirely clear about where that power originated. It did not arise from battlefield victories, or accumulated wealth, or the collective will of the populace. It descended from the heavens, lowered directly from the celestial realm by the Anunnaki, and entrusted to a carefully chosen few who were appointed to serve as living channels between the divine order and the mortal sphere. To the temple scribes, this was no poetic figure of speech. It was foundational reality. It was the core principle upon which their entire social order was constructed. Viewed through this lens, the structural hierarchy of the pre-flood era becomes remarkably clear. A profound divide separated the general population from this designated tier of rulers. The common people were understood to exist for the physical upkeep of the land, to dig the canals, work the fields, and sustain the daily operations of the city. But standing above them was a category of leaders described in fundamentally different terms, possessing vast spans of existence, set apart by birth, ritual, and status, exercising a governance that reached far beyond the boundaries of an ordinary mortal life. And some of the tangible evidence for this worldview is carved into one of the most intriguing artifacts ever brought to light, the Weld-Blundell prism, a four-sided pillar of inscribed clay, preserved today within the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. It contains the text of the Sumerian King's List, and what immediately commands attention is the scale of time recorded across its faces. Before the catastrophic waters swept over the land, the tablet names only 8 rulers, 8 sovereigns, spanning an epoch that the text states lasted for more than 241,000 years. Individual reigns that are documented not in years, but in centuries. The scribes who preserved these lists did so without hesitation. They recorded these monumental spans with the exact same calm, matter-of-fact tone used for routine city accounts, showing that to those who maintained the state archives, these early rulers were understood to be something entirely distinct from ordinary humanity. And as we look closer into these early records, we find that this separation was not confined to kings alone. The texts speak of counselors, scholars, as well as high priests who worked alongside these early courts, beings who held vast knowledge of sacred geometry, star mapping, agriculture, and medicine. Figures who occupied a specific classification, carrying truths that were systematically shielded from public view. Perhaps these ancient lineages were never truly extinguished. Perhaps what we are reading in the cuneiform clay are the initial traces of a long-term preservation. Knowledge and inheritances that were intentionally drawn back into the shadows, carried forward in quiet through the rise and fall of kingdoms, and continuing to move beneath the surface of history, down to the present day. If you are listening to this in the still quiet of the night, let us know where and when you are joining us from in the comments section below. It is quietly comforting to realize that countless listeners, scattered across distant lands and different time zones, are all settling into the same quiet journey through the forgotten echoes of human history. And if you are enjoying this Sumerian history for sleep narrative, finding it helps you relax or even drift off, consider subscribing to the channel. It helps support our efforts to keep bringing you these ancient stories each week, and continue reaching others who are searching for the same calm place to relax and unwind. So as the evening settles, allow yourself to rest comfortably. Let the press of the day fade into the background as the surroundings grow calm and quiet. The room dims, the noise of the modern world recedes, replaced with the distant glow of hearth fires echoing across the ancient southern plains. Terraced mud brick ziggurats rise silently above the marshlands, their high walls catching the cool moonlight. The night air carries the scent of fresh water and river reeds. The ancient delta stretches wide into the dark, and somewhere within that quiet landscape, an enduring legacy has already taken root. A pattern set in motion long before the floodwaters rose, that was never truly broken. Marking the start of some of the greatest historical artifacts of the ancient world, the text of the Weld-Blundell prism opens in an ancient settlement, known to early scribes as the oldest city on earth. Emerging through the morning mist that clings to the riverbank, the ancient contours of Eridu begin to take shape against the pale sky. Known to the earliest scribes as the cradle of organized society, it was here, on the wide southern floodplains, that human order was believed to have established its first permanent footing. And according to the cuneiform archives, it was within these mud brick walls that a monumental shift occurred. A moment when supreme governing authority was lowered directly from the celestial realm, not through a gradual rise of political power or military conquest, but as a singular and decisive event. The historical chronicles document this arrival with unyielding certainty. The mandate of kingship descended from above, and its very first mortal bearer was Alulim of Eridu. Recognized in the records as the primeval sovereign of the pre-flood world, he is credited with a reign that spanned 28,800 years. The ancient tablets offer this vast duration without hesitation, presenting it as an established matter of historical fact. To the minds of the early scribes, they were not describing a conventional leader who had simply climbed the ranks of tribal society. They were documenting a designated vessel, an individual uniquely conditioned to hold an authority far greater than any ordinary human life could contain. Nam Lugal was never viewed as a mere political office. It was treated as a tangible, profound spiritual force, an institution that required a specific physical lineage, rigorous ritual preparation, as well as absolute discipline to prevent it from overwhelming the body of the one chosen to bear it. The physical structure of Eridu was designed around a central axis that the ancients called the Abzu, the house of the subterranean waters. Long before the massive terraced ziggurats dominated the skyline of Uruk or the shrine at Eridu was little more than a single modest room constructed from marsh reeds and sun-dried mud bricks. Yet across 17 distinct archaeological layers, excavators discovered that this exact site was rebuilt continuously over thousands of years, growing larger, taller, as well as more elaborate with each generation. At the lowest level, directly above the virgin soil, lay the ashes of the earliest hearth fires and the fossilized remains of small freshwater fish, offered to Enki before writing itself had even been developed. As the centuries progressed, the simple shrine expanded into a massive temple complex raised high on a sacred platform, isolated from the surrounding city by thick enclosure walls. This physical separation was not accidental. The architectural layout reflected the exact spiritual hierarchy recorded on the tablets. The common population inhabited small mud brick dwellings scattered among the reed beds along the perimeter of the city, working the irrigation canals that channeled fresh water from the river into the surrounding fields. The inner temple precincts, however, were strictly reserved for the king and the consecrated priesthood. The throne room within the Abzu was designed to replicate the cosmic domain of Enki himself. Low stone basins filled with running water lined the walls, while deep subterranean channels beneath the brick flooring allowed the cool natural flow of the local springs to circulate through the structure. When the king sat upon the throne of Eridu, he was physically resting above the flowing waters of the Abzu. To the Sumerian mind, this was not symbolic decoration. It was a functional environment engineered to allow the ruler to absorb the wisdom of the water god while maintaining the strict ritual boundaries required to preserve his sacred authority. Observing this delicate structure from above was the supreme triad of the Sumerian pantheon: Anu, the lord of the high heavens and master of cosmic order; Enlil, the force of wind, storm, as well as the decrees that shaped the fate of nations; and Enki, the sovereign of the subterranean freshwater depths known as the Apsu, the god of wisdom, creation along with the intricate design of living things. These three divine forces oversaw a system that was deeply layered and precise. The rulers appointed to govern the earthly domain were not chosen by popular acclaim or military councils. Within the framework of the tablets, they were ritually tailored conduits to the divine realm. Specific individuals whose bloodlines had been curated to serve as living bridges between the heavenly council and the population below. Scribes noted that every administrative protocol executed in Eridu had to align with the movements of the night sky. The temple priests maintained detailed observational journals on soft clay, recording the rising and setting of specific constellations to ensure that royal proclamations coincided with cosmic alignments. If a canal was to be excavated or a new grain vault established, the timing was determined by celestial charts stored in the high archives. After Alulim's reign had come to pass, he was succeeded by Alangar, who governed for 36,000 years. Together, these two sovereigns guided the primeval settlement through a little over 18 sars of early time. That's over 64,000 years. 640 centuries in the first two reigns of ancient Sumer alone, establishing the foundational practices of irrigation, brickmaking, as well as temple administration. And when Eridu eventually lost its primary status, the royal authority shifted to Bad-tibira. In that city, 3 successive monarchs continued to hold power for spans that challenge modern historical frameworks. Enmenluana ruled for 43,200 years. Enmengalana governed for 28,800 years. The shepherd king Dumuzi ruled for 36,000 years. From Bad-tibira, the seat of governance moved to Larak, where Ensi-Pasidana ruled for 28,800 years. The center then shifted northward to Sippar, where Enmeduranki governed for 21,000 years. Finally, kingship settled in Shurapak, where Yubar Tutu ruled for 18,600 years, serving as the final monarch before the Great Deluge altered the face of the ancient world. When calculated together across 5 sacred cities, these 8 pre-flood reigns total 241,200 years. Early epigraphers initially viewed these immense spans as pure symbolic allegory. Yet as duplicate fragments were unearthed from Nippur, Lhasa, and Nineveh, archivists realized that ancient scribes copied these figures with remarkable consistency across centuries. To the temple scribes, this antediluvian era was not a fictional myth, but a real and foundational epoch of human civilization. What distinguishes this section of the King List is the sharp boundary drawn between the world before the deluge and the epoch that followed. Following the flood, the cuneiform text notes that kingship descended a second time, establishing its seat in Kish. From that moment forward, human lifespans and royal reigns contracted sharply, dropping from tens of thousands of years down to standard historical spans. This sudden contraction in royal longevity marks a turning point in the ancient record. The scribes were not presenting a gradual evolution of human capability. They were documenting a deliberate boundary between an elevated primeval order and the reduced mortal world that succeeded it. Yet even with this elevated preparation, the kings were not expected to bear such immense responsibility alone. The gods recognized that governing an emerging world required a depth of understanding that went far beyond natural human development. And so, to bridge this vast gap, Enki dispatched the Apkallu, the 7 sages of antiquity, brought forth directly from the freshwater depths of his domain to guide humanity through its formative era. These were not beings born of human unions or fashioned through any ordinary mortal means. Formed by Enki's direct will through sacred incantations now lost to history, they were semi-divine emissaries. Immortal, otherworldly, and possessing vast knowledge beyond anything we can comprehend. Ancient reliefs depict them stepping from the shimmering waters on misty mornings, clad in the scaled pelts of great sacred fish, their cloaks glistening under the rising sun. Carved into monumental stone panels, these figures stand side by side with the early kings, holding ceremonial vessels and sacred symbolic pine cones. Here we can clearly see that the physical reality of these fish-cloaked sages was never left to floating oral traditions alone. Archaeologists excavating the great ruined palaces of Nimrud and Nineveh uncovered massive heavy stone reliefs carved directly into the palace walls themselves. These giant gypsum slabs depict the Apkallu standing in exquisite detail, forever holding their sacred buckets and Mullaloo cones beside the ancient tree of life. Beyond the massive wall panels, the image of the sages were pressed continuously into daily ancient life, through tiny and intricately carved cylinder seals. These small stone cylinders were slowly rolled across wet clay documents to leave a raised, detailed impression as an official mark of protection and authority. Thousands of these seal impressions have been recovered from the dirt, clearly showing the half-man and half-fish guardians standing shoulder to shoulder with early Mesopotamian rulers. And in the quiet rooms of the British Museum, visitors can still gaze upon delicate clay figurines known as the protective watchers. These small molded statues were baked in ovens and inscribed with ancient protective incantations before being buried beneath the floors of royal homes. Excavators found dozens of these small figures buried under doorways and room corners, placed there specifically to ward off unseen forces and guard the threshold. Through actual physical texts like the Uruk list of kings and sages, we see that each Apkallu was paired directly with a specific ruler, a dedicated union designed to ensure the accurate transmission of divine knowledge across generations. Discovered in the ruins of a Seleucid period temple, this small rectangular clay tablet explicitly lists 7 post-flood kings right alongside their designated Apkallu councillors. By recording their names in rigid administrative columns, ancient scribes treated these hybrid teachers as factual historical figures, rather than mere mythic allegories. Even the sacred implements shown to be held in the hands of the sages reflect genuine historical objects recovered from Mesopotamian soil. The ceremonial buckets, known as the bandudu, match bronze and stone vessels pulled directly from ancient temple ruins across southern Iraq, physical remnants that provide a clear, lasting bridge between mysterious spiritual lore and the actual material culture of the ancient world. And throughout all of it, the Apkallu's primary directive was the delivery of the Holy May, the fundamental blueprints, principles, and arts of all human civilization. Spoken in deeply resonant tones that echoed the steady movement of the tides, the sages instructed the earliest sovereigns in mathematics, sacred geometry, architecture, law, medicine, and the silent movements of the night sky itself. Without the May, early society had no foundation. Scribes recorded that there was specific May for the elevation of the royal crown, the construction of brick molds, the weaving of linen garments, and the judicial management of city disputes. Every craft and administrative procedure carried its own sacred instruction, preventing any deviation from the original blueprint, established in Eridu. The sages remain some of the most enigmatic figures in ancient lore, appearing repeatedly across different cultures and eras under varying names, yet always fulfilling the exact same guiding role as the hidden teachers of mankind. And while many are familiar with the basic accounts of kings and sages, the oldest temple records contain subtle references to another group entirely, figures who carried an unspoken designation, beings who did not fit the standard historical framework, remembered with a deep sense of quiet unease, and whose records the later scribes attempted, with painstaking effort, to erase from human memory forever. Because there are parts of the historical record that even the scribes themselves seemed hesitant to discuss openly. Deep within the quiet storage vaults of international museums, and preserved inside climate-controlled cases far from public view, rests a specific classification of ancient clay. Artifacts that carry an archival stamp, unlike anything else surviving from the ancient world. 19th century epigraphers cataloguing these remnants routinely encountered the same distinct warning, pressed into the wet clay. Nissi Tuppi, translating as the secret of the tablet, marked specifically as knowledge withheld from the uninitiated. These were not routine economic ledgers or agricultural tallies or public royal monuments. They were classified records, kept apart from the general population, reserved strictly for the eyes of the high priesthood, who operated at the very center of the state apparatus. Figures whose allegiances were tied directly to the ruling monarchs funding their temple complexes. But what specific information required such absolute secrecy? Among these restricted texts lies a broken clay document, recovered from the ruins of ancient Assur. It is a document that remains largely unknown outside specialized academic circles. Known in official catalogues as KAR4, this bilingual tablet was inscribed in Sumerian as well as Akkadian. The copied inscription alone indicates that its contents were considered vital enough to preserve across two distinct languages, along with two cultural eras. And when epigraphers analyzed that physical artifact, the designation KR4 refers to Kehlschrifttexte aus Assur-religiösen Inhalts, Volume 4. Artifact number 4. The physical clay itself is heavily damaged along the right margin and missing crucial lines near the bottom corner. That physical damage forced scholars to spend decades cross-referencing broken signs against minor duplicate fragments recovered from Nineveh. The tablet is structured in two distinct parallel columns. On the left side, the text is inscribed in standard classical Sumerian, which served as the archaic liturgical language of the early temples. On the right side, an exact parallel translation is provided in Neo-Assyrian Akkadian. This side-by-side format was only used for texts of extreme institutional importance, the kinds of documents that scribes were usually required to study and copy and memorize as part of their advanced training in the royal academies. But what makes the linguistic layout of KAR4 so remarkable, beyond just its forbidden mark, is the contents within, and the specific terminology used to describe the creation of the first two human creations by the hands of the Anunnaki gods, and their names were Uligara and Anagara. While standard creation texts use the common verb banu, meaning to build or construct, KAR4 employs specialized scribal terms that imply an intentional modeling process. They describe using the finest clay taken directly from the foundation of the Apsu and mixed with the blood of sacrificed divine beings. The text specifically notes that their creation was executed in a secluded sanctuary called the Dur-an-Ki, recognized as the bond of heaven and earth. They were not fashioned on the open plains or within public view. They were formed inside a closed and consecrated space under the personal supervision of the wise water god Enki and the birth goddess Ninmah. The names themselves carry profound etymological meaning. Uligara translates roughly as the established structure of humanity. A Nagara signifies the divine draft or template. They were not merely two individual humans, they were the designated prototypes for an elevated and guided lineage. What KAR4 details is an entirely separate account of human origin. It is a narrative that diverges sharply from the standard creation myths most commonly associated with Mesopotamian lore, presenting a perspective that the public records quietly omitted. The general laboring population, designated in early texts as the Lulu, were never assigned individual titles in the creation records. They were fashioned as a collective workforce identified as a broad group, rather than distinct individuals. Much like the Ijiji whom they were created to replace, who served as the lower tier of divine beings who had carried the physical burdens of the earth in its earliest primordial days. But Uligara and Anagara were crafted under an entirely different directive. For some reason, scribes felt compelled to document them as a distinct category, suggesting that ancient archivists were tracking two separate human populations prior to the Great Flood. One population was broad and unnamed, assigned strictly to physical labor. The other was named and specific, placed under the direct guidance of Enki himself. To house these specialized clay records, temple architects designed subterranean storage chambers within the foundation walls of the ziggurats. These low-vaulted rooms were sealed with asphalt and lined with reed matting to repel dampness, and were guarded by consecrated wardens. Only senior scholars who had taken binding oaths were granted access to the cedar chests containing the Nissi Tuppi series, keeping the true lineage accounts isolated from all lower administrative scribes. In later copies produced during the Middle Babylonian period, these specific lines were systematically altered. The individual names were removed and replaced by the generic phrase Lulu Amelu, meaning simply mortal laborer. The distinct creation event in the Duran Key was condensed into a brief summary, and the tablet was catalogued under the restricted header, ensuring that future generations of student scribes would only encounter the simplified public version of the story. Whether human administrators buried these records to protect their own political power, or whether the directive came from a higher authority, the tablets do not explicitly state. That deliberate ambiguity remains one of the most compelling aspects of the entire cuneiform record. But to attempt to understand why this suppression occurred, one must look at how temple archives functioned across Mesopotamia. Scribes were not independent historians recording events for public interest. They were sworn officers of the state and trained in secluded scriptoriums that were attached to the great administrative complexes of Nippur, Eridu, and Babylon. Every tablet copied was an act of political preservation. The omission of Uligara and Anagara from later texts was not an accidental oversight by fatigued copyists, but an intentional policy executed across centuries to align historical narrative with royal doctrine. The architectural design of the scriptoriums further reflects this tight institutional control. At sites like the Temple of Enlil in Nippur, archivists stored standard legal agreements and land grants in brightly lit outer chambers openly accessible to public officials. Meanwhile, restricted tablets were placed in subterranean chambers accessed only through narrow passages beneath the main sanctuary floor. These inner sanctums were constructed with thick mud brick walls engineered to dampen sound and shield sacred texts from moisture, fire, and curious eyes. The scribes who worked in these quiet vaults underwent decades of rigorous preparation. Entering the order as young children, they began by mastering simple agricultural lists before progressing to complex administrative formulas and advanced astronomical calculations. Only after reaching the highest rank of Umanu, or master scholar, were they permitted to view the Nissi Tuppi tablets. They were taught that to share these texts with the uninitiated was to invite cosmic disorder and immediate death by divine decree. This layered system of secrecy ensured that two parallel histories existed simultaneously across the ancient Near East. The public history recited during seasonal festivals and recorded on monumental stone stele presented humanity as a uniform and compliant labor force. existing solely to serve the gods and their appointed kings, the hidden history preserved in the subterranean archives of Ashur and Nineveh documented an elevated lineage, engineered with direct divine oversight and possessing capabilities that threatened the stability of the entire hierarchy. When we examine the broken surface of KAR-4 today, we are looking at the surviving remnants of that hidden record. The missing margins and eroded signs speak to centuries of intentional neglect and quiet suppression. Yet despite every effort to erase their names from collective memory, the ancient figures of Uligara and Anagara continue to stand as silent witnesses to a forgotten chapter of human origins, preserved beneath the soil for thousands of years. And beyond even that, the administrative archives preserve traces of a much quieter and far more controlled set of operations. Deep within the lower chambers of the ancient temple complexes, scribes maintained records that dealt not with the general populace, but with the internal mechanics of divine governance itself. Fragmented ledgers and marginal annotations on daily inventory clays make repeated mention of the Pazu, the sacred rites and operational procedures required to manage the physical authority of Nam Lugal. To the common citizens tilling fields along the canals, the Pazu were understood as intangible forces that kept the natural world in balance. But to the elite priesthood, these documents functioned as explicit instruction manuals, detailing the exact physical and spiritual preparation a king had to undergo before entering the innermost sanctum of the ziggurat. The physical setting for these operations was the Giparu, the inner residential heart of the temple compound. Isolated behind thick mud brick walls and accessible only through guarded corridors, the Giparu contained private courtyard suites, bathhouses, and ritual purification chambers. It was here that the ruler was separated from the ordinary world. He was brought into these quiet spaces to undergo multi-day conditioning programs of a sort, which were overseen by senior exorcist priests, known as the Ashipu. The Ashipu were not ordinary clergy. They were specialized practitioners, trained in the diagnostic manuals of the temple academies, and skilled in identifying spiritual influence. They applied precise counter-procedures to protect the royal lineage, and when a designated ruler was prepared for royal induction, the Ashipu initiated a rigid protocol, a protocol that was designed to prepare his mind and body, securing him against corruption. The texts even describe purification rituals involving sacred cedar oils imported from the northern mountains, pristine water drawn from the river just prior to sunrise, and crushed lapis lazuli mixed with sacred herbs. This meticulous conditioning was not viewed as mere theatrical ceremony. It was treated as a vital necessity and a protective measure of utmost importance, designed to ensure the ruler remained stable while holding the divine mandate. The preparation began at twilight inside the outer courtyard of the Giparu. The king was stripped of all standard garments, jewelry, and personal ornaments, leaving him completely unadorned. Priests conducted the first washing ceremony using water, drawn from dedicated deep wells. These wells tapped directly into the underlying water tables, representing the pure currents and rejuvenating waters of the Apsu. Following the primary washing, the king was anointed with aromatic compounds. Scribes recorded exact recipes for these mixtures, specifying precise proportions of myrrh, resin, cypress extract, and specialized oils rendered from animal fat. The oil was then rubbed systematically into the joints, the chest, the forehead, and the soles of the feet. This process was believed to protect the physical body, creating a barrier against harmful forces that might seek to destabilize the ruler during his encounter with the divine realm. This level of care reveals an extraordinary aspect of early Mesopotamian statecraft. Kingship was not handled as a simple political appointment or a military title. It was treated as a delicate inheritance. It was a responsibility so immense that even those born to the designated bloodlines required constant management to bear its weight. During the ascension process, the candidate was required to observe strict dietary fasting for 7 consecutive days. His intake was restricted to unflavored barley wafers and pure water, ensuring that no impurities entered his system during the critical phase of transmission. Priests recited long sequences of incantations to clear the physical space of spiritual interference. They used heavy copper censers filled with burning juniper and frankincense, drifting thick smoke into every corner of the inner chamber. And only after these preparatory phases were fully executed and verified by the head exorcist would the king be clad in his ceremonial robes, not standard garments, but robes woven from unbleached wool, treated with mineral dyes, and embroidered with gold thread, forming geometric patterns that mirrored the constellation maps kept in the temple observatories. Once fully clothed, the king was presented with the primary instruments of governance: the scepter, the crown, and the measuring rod and line. These symbols were directly linked to the ancient May, the foundational instructions delivered by the sages. By holding the measuring rod and line, the king demonstrated his alignment with the cosmic geometry established by Enki. He was expected to apply those exact structural principles to the construction of temples, the layout of irrigation systems, the positioning of city walls, and the fair distribution of agricultural land across the kingdom. The measuring rod and line were not merely symbolic badges of office. They represented the mathematical integrity of the state. In the eyes of the temple administration, a ruler who failed to apply true geometric proportions to his city plans was violating the primary May, inviting physical collapse and divine disfavor upon his domain. And this is precisely why these protocols were designated Nissi Tuppi. The temple archives functioned as literal vaults, keeping advanced medical understanding, astronomical calculations, and ritual mechanics locked away from public view. If an unauthorized individual gained access to the Pazu, they would possess the operational knowledge required to emulate royal authority, disrupting the established hierarchy managed by the priesthood. By restricting access to these fundamental operations, the ruling elite ensured that the bridge between the celestial realm and the mortal world remained entirely under their control. The general population was kept dependent on the temple apparatus for their relationship with the divine, while the true nature of the sovereign lineage was shielded behind layers of secrecy and sacred fear. As the centuries progressed, these restricted manuals were gradually withdrawn even further from standard temple libraries. Copies were restricted to fewer hands until the explicit instructions faded into cryptic symbolism, yet the underlying structure remained clear. The authority to rule was never intended to be shared, analyzed, or understood by the world at large. It was a closed system, engineered to preserve an elevated order that traced its roots all the way back to the primeval age of Eridu. And when modern archaeologists began cutting into the deep soil layers of ancient they uncovered actual physical evidence in the soil itself. Evidence that brought these text accounts out of the realm of abstract scribal history and directly into the earth. Because beneath layers of early dynastic debris, Sir Leonard Woolley's team struck a massive, uninterrupted deposit of clean river silt. 11 feet of water-laid clay, containing no stone artifacts, no broken pottery, and no human remains. Woolley's systematic excavation of the Royal Cemetery of between 1922 and 1934 remains one of the most meticulous field projects in the history of Near Eastern archaeology. To reach the earliest royal tombs, his team had to dig through over 40 feet of accumulated urban debris, cutting through layers of discarded pottery, collapsed mud brick walls, and ash from ancient kilns. It was beneath these dynastic layers that they encountered tomb PG 800, the unlooted burial chamber of Queen Puabi. The chamber was constructed from roughly dressed limestone blocks and vaulted with sun-dried clay bricks, set deep at the bottom of a massive rectangular pit. And when Woolley cleared the collapsed roof of the chamber, he found the queen's skeleton resting upon a wooden bier, surrounded by an astonishing array of personal items. Her head was adorned with a massive and intricate headdress composed of over 30 feet of beaten gold ribbon, layered with heavy gold leaves, lapis lazuli beads, and carnelian spheres. Near her right shoulder rested 3 delicate cylinder seals, carved from solid lapis lazuli, one of which explicitly bore her title, Nin, a term designating supreme female authority or queenly status. Adjacent to the burial chamber lay the Great Death Pit, containing the remains of 74 individuals. 5 armed soldiers standing guard near the entrance, and 69 women wearing silver and gold hair ribbons, all arranged in neat rows alongside grand wooden lyres. The instruments were inlaid with mother-of-pearl, shell, and red limestone. Featuring life-sized golden bullheads mounted on the boxes, their eyes fashioned from deep blue lapis lazuli imported from Badakhshan, in what is now Afghanistan. Directly beneath this vast burial horizon, Woolley sank a deep test shaft to examine the underlying natural soil. It was here that he struck the 11-foot layer of completely clean, unstratified river silt. Chemical analysis confirmed that this massive clay deposit was laid down by standing water during an extraordinary inundation that completely submerged the early settlements of the valley. Yet beneath that thick bed of flood silt, the excavators hid pottery fragments, flint blades, and painted clay tools belonging to the pre-flood Ubaid culture. The soil itself had recorded a physical and geological reality, one that mirrored the written claims of the cuneiform lists. An advanced civilization existed, was covered by an immense water event, and was immediately succeeded by a rebuilt order, one that maintained the exact artistic and administrative traditions of the Old World. This clean clay layer marked a sharp, absolute boundary in the stratigraphy of ancient Mesopotamia. It was the physical scar of a catastrophic deluge, an event so devastating that it severed the ancient world in two, dividing the long spans of the antediluvian era from everything that followed. Directly above and below that flood layer, the physical remnants tell a story not of total annihilation, but of deliberate continuity. And inside the royal tombs of Ur, dating to the centuries following the flood, excavators discovered extraordinary treasures that revealed an unbroken line of elite status. Golden helmets crafted to resemble elaborate braided hair, intricate lyres featuring bearded golden bulls, adorned with lapis lazuli and the famous royal headpiece of Queen Puabi, fashioned from hundreds of delicate gold leaves, carnelian beads, and rare blue stone, buried alongside their entire royal courts. Soldiers, musicians, and servants, arranged in precise order, holding golden cups and ceremonial vessels. This was not a chaotic burial. It was a highly organized, ritualized transition, demonstrating that even after the catastrophic waters receded, the ruling class possessed the immense wealth and authority required to command absolute devotion. What survived the rising waters was not chosen at random. The sacred arts, The astronomical charts, the architectural proportions, and the specific bloodlines designated by Nam Lugal were carefully preserved across the boundary of the deluge. The cuneiform texts explain that when the sky cleared, kingship was lowered a second time, descending directly upon Kish before spreading back across the rebuilt cities of the southern plains. The ancient knowledge had been curated. The sacred blueprints had been rescued from the floodwaters, ensuring that the elevated tier of divine representatives would continue to govern the newly emerging world. The deep pits of offer tangible proof that the pre-flood traditions were not mere myths created by late scribes. They reveal a society that was obsessed with tracking its heritage, all the way back to the time before the sky turned dark. A culture that built its entire authority upon the claim that its rulers carried an unbroken inheritance salvaged directly from the ancient world. And so, the quiet truth of that ancient world remains preserved, written not only into surviving tablets, but pressed forever into the very soil beneath our feet. Beyond the royal tombs and the deep strata of the earth, the physical record leaves us with a quiet realization that the past was never truly lost. It simply settled into the landscape, dissolving gently into the long, unhurried expanse of time that followed. As the noise of ancient empires fades into silence, the world retreats into a deeper, far more peaceful rhythm. The intense focus on dynasties, sacred lineages, and administrative decrees softens into the quiet background of the Mesopotamian plains. What remains is the timeless landscape itself, resting beneath the calm sky, inviting everything to slow down and breathe in the stillness of the night. Life across the Mesopotamian plains continued its quiet journey. The soft earth rests beneath a returning sun as people quietly engage in the simple tasks of early life. They gather fresh river reeds along the banks, shape damp clay with practiced hands, and lay down the first courses of new walls directly over ancient foundations, without any sense of urgency. All that sacred inheritance held within the holy May and preserved inside specific lineages remained safely intact. It rested inside quiet mines and dark temple archives, until the conditions became right once again as the rush of historical time slowed completely into an unfolding stillness. As twilight settles over the mud-brick cities, the last rays of evening light pull back from the whitewashed walls of the high ziggurats. The bright surfaces turn from pale gold to warm amber before fading softly into the deep indigo of approaching night. In the open courtyards below, hearth fires glow low and warm, casting slow shadows along clay walls that still hold the gentle heat of the day. The evening breeze carries the sweet scent of sun-baked silt, ripening date palms, and cool river water across the flatlands. Nearby, the Euphrates moves in a slow, constant rhythm through the dense reed beds, carrying its cool breath across the quiet settlements. The air grows still and light, settling peacefully over the surrounding fields. Inside the dark temple vaults of the Aduba, rows of wet clay tablets rest in the cool air, slowly drying in the dark. Their silent wedge marks hold star charts, royal lineages, and ancient incantations, resting patiently without needing anyone to watch over them. These sacred records sit in complete stillness, holding the quiet weight of antiquity while the world outside grows dark and soft. Above the sleeping cities, the night sky opens up star by star, revealing the exact same fixed constellations mapped by earlier eyes. In the quiet courtyards, An elder gestures toward a familiar star pattern, guiding a small hand pointing upward into the dark. The ancient wisdom moves forward endlessly, passing gently across generations through the simple, unhurried transfer of attention. The quiet air of the evening deepens, wrapping the ancient mud-brick terraces in a mantle of serene, uninterrupted shadow. Soft moonlight glimmers off the tranquil surface of the irrigation canals, reflecting the endless expanse of the heavens above like polished stone. Every passing moment invites a deeper quiet to settle over the flatlands, softening every remaining edge of the waking world. Far across the darkened plain, the distant fragrance of crushed cypress wood and burnt juniper lingers gently in the night air. The gentle rustle of palm fronds along the riverbank creates a soothing melody, echoing the steady and ancient heartbeat of the land itself. Everything remains held in perfect balance, resting peacefully within the timeless rhythm that has guided humanity across countless ages, all resting under the quiet, watchful gaze of the cosmos. The vast floodplains stretch endlessly into the twilight, cradled by the soft whispering currents of the twin rivers. Every layer of clay beneath the surface holds a soft whisper of those who walked before, cradling their thoughts, their hopes, and their discoveries in perpetual quietude. In this deep sanctuary of ancient antiquity, time dissolves into a seamless and peaceful expanse. In this deep sanctuary of ancient antiquity, time dissolves into a seamless and peaceful expanse. The glowing points of starlight mirror the gentle currents flowing softly below them, weaving heaven and earth into a single tranquil realm. As the atmosphere grows thick with ease, every breath slows into harmony with the ancient world, inviting complete stillness to wash over every corner of the mind. As the night stretches wide and silent, the mind gently untethers itself from the passage of time. You are floating upon that warm and golden current, completely supported by the deep wisdom of the ancient past. Surrounded by the serene presence of the quiet earth, you yield softly to the darkness, drifting into a deep and untroubled slumber beneath the celestial dome. There is a slow, warm, golden current running beneath the surface of the night, carrying all memory, time, and life forward. And beneath the quiet rhythm of your own breath, that ancient current moves softly through everything we see and everything we are. The heavy weight of consciousness grows lighter and softer as the vast distance between heaven and earth widens under the open sky. The expanse remains full, soft, and very old, holding a peaceful comfort that has watched over slumbers since memory first began. Just like our ancestors before us, we are all held safely within that same silent embrace. You can sink further and further still into the deep and untroubled space between the turning stars, resting in total peace. For the stories of our ancient origins do not truly end when the words fall silent. They linger quietly within the gentle turn of the earth, woven into the very fabric of the stars above and the silent soil below. Everything that was built, dreamed, or discovered in those distant ages remains part of the same unbroken thread, quietly connecting every generation beneath the same vast and enduring sky. And as you drift deeper into rest, held within the soft expanse of the night, you carry that ancient inheritance forward into your dreams. The past rests patiently beside you, continuous, eternal, and still. The stars keep their unhurried watch above, cradling the world in an endless embrace of timelessness.